Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Baan Alzuhair. I'm a fourth year medical student, and today we'll be discussing the female reproduction cycle. I tried to simplify this lecture as much as I could. This lecture is very short, but it is heavy in information. So I hope this is going to be more helpful than the original lecture itself, since it's in a more simplified version of the original one. So let's start. Bismillah. These are our objectives for today. So first, we'll start discussing the reproductive cycle itself. What is a reproductive cycle? It's a cycle of two major phases. It happens every 28 days, but it can happen every 35. So it ranges from 28 to 35. And each phase lasts up to 14 days each. So the phases are called, the first phase is called follicular phase, and the second phase is called luteal phase. They're also called the proliferative and secretory phase. They're also called the ovulatory and endometrial phase. There are so many names for the same phases, but in general, when we talk about the cycle, we're talking about two phases. But there is a major event that happens between the phases in the middle, day 14 to be exact, and that's ovulation. That's when the oocyte is leaving the ovary and it jumps into the fallopian tube and waits to be fertilized. This whole process is regulated by a higher up place that is called the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And we're going to talk about their function and the hormones that they secrete right now. Okay, so let's start with these hormones. The first hormone that we need to talk about is estrogen. Estrogen is produced by the theca cells and the granulosa cells found in the ovaries. Progesterone is produced by the follicular cells in the ovaries due to the LH surge. Okay, we'll talk about LH in a second. So progesterone is converted from cholesterol by CYP11A1 and 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. The third hormone is GnRH. GnRH is produced by the hypothalamus. It stands for gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And GnRH affects the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland, in response to GnRH, produces LH and FSH. LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and FSH stands for follicular stimulating hormone. LH will affect the theca cells in the ovaries, and FSH will affect the granulosa cells mainly in the ovaries, but it does affect other things, and the LH affects other things as well, but we'll discuss that in a minute. Then we have androgens, or the male hormones, some people call it, testosterone. Okay, androgens are produced by the adrenals, ovaries, and peripheral conversion of androstenedione and DHEA to testosterone. There's also conversion of androgens to testosterone in the follicle, and this conversion is limited by higher levels of SHBG. SHBG stands for steroid hormone binding globulin. This globulin is higher in females because when this globulin binds to androgens, it kind of inactivates them. So they don't have much of an effect on us. That's why in females, SHBG is higher to protect them from virilization. Virilization means having male features such as hirsutism, acne, or like deep voice. So by nature, we have higher levels of SHBG. Next, we have inhibin. Inhibin is produced by granulosa cells of mature follicles, and it's regulated by FSH and LH. Inhibin has two types, inhibin B and inhibin A. Inhibin B is a marker of granulosa cell function, and this is the one that's controlled by FSH. So inhibin B, what it does is that it induces the expression of LH receptors on the granulosa cells. Whereas inhibin A is a marker of corpus luteum function. It's produced alongside progesterone, and we're going to talk about corpus luteum later. And inhibin A is the one that's controlled by LH. Lastly, we have activin. Activin is produced by granulosa cells to upregulate FSH receptors on granulosa cells themselves. Okay, I hope everything is clear so far. So we'll dive into the menstrual cycle. This is a picture that I got off the internet. It's not very detailed, but I just want to give you guys a general idea of what it looks like. So the menstrual cycle starts with menstruation. Day 1 of the cycle is day 1 of menstruation. Menstruation varies between each person. It can go up to 5 days. Some people have it 4, some people have it 7. It depends really. And then the rest of the menstrual cycle, you start with the follicular phase. Follicular phase actually starts from day 3 to day 5 of menstruation. And ovulation is day 14, as you can see here. That's why the color is darker. And then from day 14 to day 28, that's the secretory phase, or the second phase, as we talked about just now. As you can see here, this is the FSH and LH curve. This is the estrogen progesterone curve. This is the folliculogenesis during this cycle, and this is what happens in the endometrium during this cycle. We're not going to go into much detail about what happens to the endometrium, but it is very important for you to understand the changes in the endometrium throughout the cycle. But this is not the topic of today's lecture. So this is a map that I have drawn with my very humble skills using PowerPoint. This is a much clearer map of the cycle than the picture that I just added, and then the original lecture by Dr. Abdul Jabbar. So let's start here. The star here is a symbol of where you should start in this map. So menstruation, day 1. You're going to have a drop in hormones in the beginning of menstruation. This drop of hormones, we're going to explain why the drop happens, but let's start here. So this drop of hormones stimulates the hypothalamus to produce GnRH. Okay, and remember what we talked about. GnRH affects the pituitary gland to produce FSH and LH. FSH will go to granulosa cells, and LH will go to theca cells. Okay, this is pure memorization. You have to memorize which affects each. Okay, so FSH will affect the granulosa cells to produce aromatase. FSH will affect the theca cells to produce androgen. Aromatase will convert androgens into estradiol. Estradiol is another term for estrogen. Okay, so estrogen will be produced by the granulosa cells and the theca cells. And then the estradiol will further stimulate more follicular growth. The FSH and LH cause follicular growth, but estradiol will even enhance that process even more. And the follicular growth is going to be even faster due to the presence of estradiol. Okay? So it will rise in the bloodstream. The levels of estradiol will rise in the bloodstream, and they will have a negative effect on FSH and LH. Okay, they will have the estradiol will have a negative effect or a negative feedback effect into FSH and LH. I'm pretty sure you guys have gone through the difference between negative feedback and positive feedback. I'm not going to go into that right now. But estradiol, when it has a negative feedback effect on FSH and LH, it decreases their release, it decreases their production. So as FSH and LH become lower in the blood, the dominant follicle is going to be selected. So there's something that is not mentioned in the beginning. The amount of follicles that are growing in the beginning of each cycle are around 15 to 20 follicles per cycle. So every month there are 15 to 20 follicles that are growing. Okay, and they enter this kind of a race. They enter this race where the dominant follicle, or the follicle that's going to be the chosen one, is the follicle that's going to grow the largest, the fastest, and it's going to be the one that has the largest number of FSH receptors. So the follicle that has the biggest number of FSH receptors is the one that's going to grow the biggest, and it's the one that's going to undergo ovulation. The rest that did not survive this race will literally die off. There's no nicer way of saying it. They will literally die off. Okay. So the dominant follicle, once it's selected, it's going to grow even bigger. It's going to produce even more estradiol. Okay. And there's something interesting that happens here. Estradiol will reach a certain threshold in the bloodstream. It will be so high in the bloodstream that the negative feedback effect that we talked about before will turn into a positive one. This is what the blue arrow here is pointing to. So estradiol started as a negative feedback effect on FSH and LH, and then it turned into a positive feedback on FSH and LH. And estradiol is one of the most amazing hormones we have to ever learn about. It's very unique. Not a lot of hormones have both feedback effects, positive and negative, and that's something to just, think about and say subhanallah about, So once estradiol has a positive effect on FSH and LH, you're going to have an FSH/LH surge, but LH more than FSH. Remember this picture? Here, as you can see, estrogen here is higher. This is the estrogen produced by the dominant follicle. Remember when we said the dominant follicle is going to produce even more estrogen? That's the estrogen produced by the dominant follicle that was picked, okay? And then when estradiol hits that threshold, you're going to have a surge in FSH and LH, but LH is more, okay? LH is the blue line here. This surge of FSH and LH happens right before ovulation, like a day or two before ovulation. So day 12, day 13, the LH surge will happen. Day 14, you're going to have um, the ovulation, okay? And ovulation is basically, we're going to talk in detail about how ovulation happens in a minute, but ovulation is basically the rupture of the follicle and the shooting out of the oocyte into the fallopian tube, and it can undergo its own journey until it gets fertilized, and if it doesn't, you're gonna go through menstruation all over again, okay? But what happens to the oocyte after it gets released is none of our business right now. We're going to talk about what happens to the follicle after it gets released. So the oocyte is released from the follicle. What's going to happen to the remaining follicle is that it's going to turn into corpus luteum. We're going to talk about how corpus luteum happens, but basically the theca cells and the blood vessels will involute, they will invade the granulosa cells, and they will become this structure that produces progesterone and inhibin. Remember what type of inhibin it produces, okay? So progesterone and inhibin will be produced by corpus luteum, and as soon as ovulation happens, the secretory phase has started, 14 to 28 days, okay? So the corpus luteum depends on whether the egg or the oocyte gets fertilized or not. If it gets fertilized, beta HCG that is produced by the blastocyst, remember when the oocyte is fertilized, it's called an ovum and then a blastocyst. There is a whole process to that, okay? So the ovum and the blastocyst produce beta HCG, and that beta HCG will keep the corpus luteum alive until the placenta takes over. When the placenta is implanted, it will secrete progesterone, it will do the corpus luteum's job, and then the corpus luteum is free to go. But if no fertilization happens, the corpus luteum can only withstand 10 to 14 days. It can only stay alive for 10 to 14 days, okay? And then it will degenerate and form something called corpus albicans. Corpus albicans is the dead form of corpus luteum, you can say that, or it's the non-functional form of corpus luteum. It does not produce anything. So this sharp decline in the production of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin will cause the shedding of the endometrium, which in other words we call menstruation. And now we are starting this whole thing all over again. This is really important for you guys to understand. You have to draw this out in your own way, use colors, use pictures, use drawings, whatever helps you in memorizing this whole process, because it's really important. This is going to help you not just right now in your exam, it's going to help you later on in your life. It's going to help you to understand a lot of things, okay? So I hope this is clear. Okay, so the doctor did not go into detail with oogenesis. He did go into detail with folliculogenesis, but I do think that oogenesis is very important to brush over before we go into folliculogenesis. So the oogenesis is what happens to the oocyte, and the oocyte is found within the follicle, okay? So the primordial germ cells, as you can see here, are formed in the embryo while it's still in the mother's womb. Like as soon as the baby is decided that it's going to be a girl, you're going to have primordial germ cells that are formed within the ovaries. There's going to be millions of primordial germ cells, millions, okay? And they're going to undergo division. They're going to reduce in numbers, and they were going to become something called oogonia, okay? The oogonias are formed around the 5th month of the pregnancy. So the oogonia will undergo even more degeneration, more atrophy. They will go from being millions to thousands. Okay, so the baby is born with around 300,000 oogonias, and there used to be millions. Okay, there's a huge amount of atrophy that happens to a lot of them. Okay, so these oogonias, they do not undergo folliculogenesis before the onset of menarche due to a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone. So they are stuck here until the patient, not the patient, but until the girl undergoes puberty. And what stops it from undergoing this whole process over here is something called the anti-Mullerian hormone. So it's stuck over here, okay? So the ones that survive the atrophy of the oogonias, okay, undergo the first meiotic division. Okay, the first meiotic division is called meiosis one, and when they undergo or they start the meiotic division, they're called the primary oocyte over here. This is the primary oocyte. However, they do not finish the meiosis one. They get arrested in a phase called prophase one. I cannot stress this enough, guys. You have to memorize which stage does this arrest in, like the primary oocyte. In which stage does it arrest in? And the secondary oocyte, they also arrest in another stage we're going to talk about in a second. So the first meiosis that happens, the primary oocyte undergoes the first meiosis, but it gets arrested in meiosis 1, prophase 1. And they're stuck here until puberty. So until the girl is pubertal, she's going to only have primary oocyte. So what takes the primary oocyte into secondary oocyte? Puberty, okay? When puberty happens, you're going to have LH surge, just like what we talked about before. The LH surge happens a couple of days before ovulation. So the LH surge causes the follicle to complete meiosis 1 and become the secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2. This is meiosis 2 over here. But it does not finish meiosis 2. It will get arrested again. But this time it will get arrested in metaphase 2 until fertilization. If it gets fertilized, it will turn into the ovum and it will undergo another process that is very detailed, and we're not going to go into it today. Okay, so I hope this is clear. All I want you guys to memorize from the slide is in which stage does the primary oocyte arrest in, and which stage does the secondary oocyte arrest in. Okay? So let's talk about folliculogenesis. Primordial follicles are the primary oocyte, basically, surrounded by a flat, simple epithelium, as you can see here. This epithelium is non-functional, okay? This is the resting stage, and it remains like this from birth until puberty. When puberty hits, primordial follicles will turn into primary follicles, and the change that happens here is that just the flat, simple epithelium will become more cuboidal. That's it, basically. And then the primary follicle will undergo more growth and become the secondary follicle. The secondary follicle, the difference here is that the granulosa cells are multi-layered. And then it will become the preantral follicle. The preantral follicle, the difference is that it has a thecal cell layer. As you can see here, the orange layer that is on the outside, this is the theca cell layer. And there are two parts of this layer. There's theca externa and theca interna, and you can tell from the name what's the difference. And a layer is inside and another layer is on the outside. And then from the preantral to the early antral, the difference is there are, as you can see here, multiple fluid-filled spaces that appear within the granulosa cell layer, okay? And then when these spaces join together and form one full space that is filled with fluid, this is called the antral follicle. As you can see here, this is the antrum. The antrum is the space, a big space filled with fluid. And once the antrum is formed, this is called the antral follicle, okay? So the cells or the follicles are all antral follicles until one of them gets selected. Remember the selection we talked about before? The follicle that gets selected is the follicle that has the biggest amount of FSH receptors. So once the follicle gets selected, it will become the Graafian follicle. So the Graafian follicle, now that it has been selected, now it's been called the chosen one, it will press itself against the ovarian wall. Once it presses itself against the ovary wall, now it's ready to release the oocyte. But before it does, remember what happens right before ovulation? LH surge. The LH is going to do a couple of things, okay? The LH, first of all, is going to release cytokines and enzymes that are going to do two things. The first thing is that it's going to loosen up the area over here around the oocyte. What is this area called? There are some cells, as you can see here, there are some cells surrounding the oocyte, and there are some cells surrounding the whole follicle. What's the difference between the two? The cells that are they're both granulosa cells, by the way, but they have different names depending on their function and their location. So the granulosa cells that are over here, they're just basically called basal granulosa cells. Okay, they surround the whole follicle, and they're going to be there until this follicle dies off. And these cells that surround the oocyte directly are called the coronary diata or the cumulus ovaris. Both names are used for the same thing. So coronary diata is the layers or are the layers of the cells that surround the oocyte directly. So these cells are important. Why? Because once LH surge happens, the LH will loosen up the oocyte plus the cells that are surrounding the oocyte directly. So the oocyte and the coronary diata are going to get more loose, and they're going to detach from this wall. As you can see here, it's very attached to this wall. But when LH comes, it will detach this whole thing from the wall, and it will swim freely in this fluid-filled space that we agreed before is called the antrum. Okay, so the oocyte and the coronary diata will be swimming here freely. Once ovulation is starting, the Graafian follicle, as we said before, presses up against the ovarian wall. When it presses up against the ovarian wall, the LH surge is going to produce cytokines and enzymes. Remember, it's going to loosen up the coronary diata, but it also does something else. It will break down the walls of this follicle, and it will allow the expulsion of the oocyte outside of the ovary and into the fallopian tubes. Okay, so the LH surge does these two things. It loosens up the coronary diata, so the oocyte and the coronary diata are swimming freely within the antrum, and it's going to break down the follicular wall and allow the expulsion of the oocyte into the fallopian tubes. And then the third thing that LH is going to do, it's going to luteinize the theca and granulosa cells to become the corpus luteum. We're going to learn more in detail about the corpus luteum later, inshallah. Okay? So I hope all of this is clear for everyone. So what is a stigma? Remember before we said that the Graafian follicle will presses itself against the ovarian wall? When it presses itself, the surface between the follicle and the ovary is called a stigma. That's basically it. This is the ovarian wall, and this is the follicle. This is the stigma. Okay, the side that is pressed up against the ovarian wall is the stigma. This is the ruptured antrum. This is the oocyte that just got released into the fallopian tube. So remember when I said that LH did a third thing? It luteinizes theca cells and it forms corpus luteum. How does it do that? The black line over here, this is the theca cells. These are the theca cells, okay? The gray area over here, these are the granulosa cells. And the orange line over here, these are the blood vessels. So the blood vessels and the theca cells, they're going to get affected by LH. And they're going to invade. Do you see here the canals that are forming over here? These are the theca cells invading the granulosa cells. It's like they're involuting into themselves. Okay, and when the theca involutes into the granulosa cell layer, it forms the corpus luteum. There's something else that happens in the formation of corpus luteum, which is the granulosa cells, the gray area over here. The granulosa cells will produce angiogenic factors. Angiogenic factors, meaning they will create more blood vessels, extensive blood supply to supply the new corpus luteum. Keep it alive as long as it can, and as we mentioned before, it can only stay alive for 10 to 14 days if no fertilization happens. So I hope this one is also clear. Okay, this slide is mentioned by the doctor. I'm not sure how important it is, but I am obligated to mention it no matter what. So I'm going to talk about something that happens within the antral follicle before selection. So in the antral follicle, the oocyte synthesizes two things that join together and form a complex. These two things are called CDK1 and cyclin B. CDK1 and cyclin B join together, they form a complex. This complex is called MPF. MPF is also called or stands for mitotic promotion factor. So from the name, this complex promotes meiosis. Remember the stage that the oocyte is arrested at? Yeah, this follicle must be arrested in meiosis 1, right? If it's arrested in meiosis 1, there is something that needs to be suppressed. What is it? The CDK1 and cyclin B. These two things, this complex needs to be repressed in order for us to arrest the oocyte in prophase 1. Okay, so what inhibits CDK1 and cyclin B? Higher levels of cyclic AMP. So this cyclic AMP right here, it inhibits cyclin B and CDK1 complexes from getting higher in the oocyte and inducing meiosis. Okay, so now that the antral follicle has gone through selection, okay, now we want it to finish meiosis 1 and go into meiosis 2 and wait until it's fertilized. How can we do that? The cyclic GMP, okay, now we're talking about cyclic GMP. Cyclic GMP from the cumulus granulosa cells, they inhibit oocyte phosphodiesterase. They keep cyclic AMP elevated. But once we want it to enter meiosis 2 and finish meiosis 1, cyclic GMP will decrease, okay? When cyclic GMP decreases, this will allow phosphodiesterase to degrade cyclic AMP. Remember, cyclic AMP is the one that kept CDK1 and cyclin B complex at rest, so meiosis doesn't happen. Now that low cyclic AMP levels are there, okay, this will allow this amazing complex, CDK1 and cyclin B, this will allow this complex to finish the nuclear division of meiosis 1 and go into meiosis 2. Remember what stage the oocyte rests in meiosis 2? The stage is metaphase 2. So metaphase 2 is the stage that the oocyte rests in until fertilization. So basically, to recap this whole thing, high levels of cyclic AMP, okay, inhibits the cyclin B and CDK1 complex. Okay, the cyclin B and CDK1 complex causes the continuation of the meiosis. We want to arrest meiosis 1 in prophase 1. So how do we do that? We increase cyclic AMP levels. And cyclic GMP also helps with that because cyclic GMP inhibits phosphodiesterase. And phosphodiesterase degrades cyclic AMP, and we don't want that now. Okay, but once LH surge happens, we want the oocyte to undergo meiosis 1, finish it, and then go into meiosis 2 and get arrested again. We want this whole thing to happen. And how do we do that? We do it by decreasing cyclic GMP levels, allowing cyclic AMP to be degraded by phosphodiesterase, and then as a result, the cyclin B, and CDK1 complex is going to complete meiosis 1, allow meiosis 1 to be completed, and then go into meiosis 2 and get arrested again in metaphase 2. I hope this slide is clear. Okay, so let's continue folliculogenesis. This is the last step of folliculogenesis. This is the corpus luteum formation. Remember what we said, how corpus luteum forms? Corpus luteum forms by the involution or the invasion of luteinized theca cells and blood vessels into the granulosa cells. It looks like this. Imagine the theca cells moving inwards. They were the outside layer, and now they're invading into the granulosa cells. It looks like a really messed up donut. That's how I imagine it, صراحة. So as we said before also, the granulosa cells will secrete angiogenic factors, increasing the blood supply to the new corpus luteum that is forming right now. LH does a fourth thing. LH is an amazing hormone. It does a lot of things. It has so many jobs. The last and fourth thing that the LH does is that it increases star proteins. Star proteins and enzymes, they stimulate granulosa cell synthesis of progesterone. The corpus luteum has two jobs. It produces two things. Remember, we mentioned this before. Corpus luteum produces progesterone along with inhibin A. Okay, so what helps it in synthesizing progesterone is the expression of star protein and star enzymes that is triggered by the LH surge. Okay, so that's basically it about corpus luteum. These are the clinical boxes that the doctor had in his slides. Mittelschmerz, that's literally how it's pronounced, Mittelschmerz. That's basically ovulatory pain. A lot of people feel it. So it's basically usually a unilateral pain that happens on the side of the ovary that is ovulating this month. Every month is different. Maybe this month your right ovary is ovulating, but the next month your left one is ovulating. Sometimes they're both. You never know. It's a surprise, really. So some people feel it, some people don't. It's kind of normal. And it's called ovulatory pain because it causes peritoneal irritation. And something else that causes peritoneal irritation is appendicitis. So it kind of mimics appendicitis pain. Okay. I have a few questions here for you guys at the end of the lecture. The answers are in the notes section, so please solve the question on your own before you look at the answer so you can really test yourself on the knowledge. And that's it. Thank you guys so much. I hope this lecture helped. I hope it simplified the original lecture. This is the QR code for the PAL feedback. This is my phone number if you guys need it. Please feel free, ask me any question you want. And thank you guys for listening.